Thank you so much. And Heather, thank you. We missed you here in Brussels, but good travels. But we're going to move on here, and we're going to shift gears slightly and talk about one facet of what it might mean to be winning in the future, and that is to talk about tech trends today, tech trends tomorrow, and whether NATO is fit for the digital age. And we'll have a good, terrific, actually, set of people with us on both ends here again, but just to introduce who will be with us here in Brussels and to invite them to the stage, we'll have Casper Klinge, Vice President for European Government Affairs at Microsoft, and Kevin Barron, Executive Editor of Defense One, both great friends of GMF, and wonderful to have you with us. Please have a seat, and I'm going to let you have a conversation for a little bit. Kevin, over to you.
Thank you, Ian.
Thanks so much.
Thank you very much. Casper, thank you for joining us. And everyone, thanks for sticking around into the wee hours of day 3. So, yeah, we're told while we're waiting for their set change and setup like last time, we can riff a little. Casper,
which I'm very concerned about, let me say that from the outset here.
Riffing, it's what ambassadors love to do. So we'll do a quick introduction. You are currently Vice President, European Government Affairs, which I guess makes you like the chief lobbyist in Europe for Microsoft. Maybe that's how I view that title. But tell us what. Please. How do you consider your role?
Yeah, no, so I think you're not too far away. Of course, we represent the interests of Microsoft in Europe, and we have a team of professionals both in Brussels and across Europe. And I think this is the place to be right now when you look at the regulatory agenda of the European Union, not least hitting digital companies or technology companies. We've seen it with COVID, we've seen it with the war in Ukraine. So what we're trying to do is fundamentally sort of align with the European agenda. So what I would say, Kevin, is we're also a little bit a lobbyist within Microsoft in trying to get the mothership to align with the European agenda.
Well, you had some experience with that. Previously, you had the great title of being ambassador to Silicon Valley, right? I mean, we were the first it was billed as from the Netherlands. How did that experience shape your perspective of now, being in a company working for Microsoft and now focusing on NATO? I mean, you must have a unique perspective being, you've worked for government, for private sector now, but focused on a multi-government, future with NATO's technology, initiatives that are on the table in Madrid today.
Yeah. Oh, it's very loud now. So I think, I love the country of the Netherlands. I did represent Denmark, but, it doesn't matter.
Sorry,
we're sort of Northern Europe,
sorry.
so, if there are any Dutch people here, we can talk afterwards if there's any interest of us coming to help out.
The Belgian Prime Minister mentioned Benelux, so, pick one. I apologize.
Not at all. I consider myself very European, so you're home free. I thought it would just be appropriate for me to point out it did not represent them.
Of course.
No, so I think the interesting thing about what we did, and by the way, many other countries are doing the same today, is to acknowledge that when you're a small country like Denmark or the Netherlands, what happens in the digital space, what happens with big technology companies, actually has a huge impact on sort of the national interest. And diplomacy has always been about putting people into sort of the hotspots of transformation. When you look at it historically, you put envoys into areas where you perhaps had conflicts or challenges. And I think in today's world, you actually need envoys that help translate from the public sector to the private sector, from the private sector to the public sector, what is happening on technology. Because I think what we're standing in front of, and again, the war in Ukraine shows that so well, is huge transformations driven by the technologies that a company like Microsoft is developing and deploying.
So I don't want to give up the goose of what you'll say when we go live with Madrid, but tell us a little bit about what you're anticipating, the work you've done in the last few months to push new policies for NATO technological transformation, innovation that you're looking for. You were talking backstage about work you've done with GlobeSec, for example.
Yeah, no. So I was privileged enough to be part of the GlobeSec Council, Future Security and Defense Council, and really trying to develop a report with some of the recommendations going into the NATO summit in Madrid. And it's a big report, and there were a lot of people in uniform part of the council. So there was a lot of what I would call sort of doctrinal recommendations. But if we zoom out and look at what the basic recommendation we made to the Secretary General was, it was in fact to create an opportunity for NATO and the private sector to come together at a moment where I think that kind of dialogue is critically important. And I don't know if I sort of revealed any state secrets by saying to you, Kevin, that we've been involved in this work for the last couple of years. we've been knocking on the doors. I've been doing that with some of my colleagues. Many of them are here today. And the door was not always opened when we were standing out at the headquarters. And I think, of course, there is a pre-Ukraine and a post-Ukraine also in terms of how NATO is now, I think, increasingly acknowledging the necessity of working closer with the private sector. And I think that's a positive step forward. And let's see what comes out of Madrid. But I'm pretty sure and optimistic that we'll see some wording in the communiqué and in the new strategic concept that is going to acknowledge the necessity of working closer with the private sector.
Well, give me a little more detail on that, of what's the type of item on the list that wasn't received well pre-Ukraine that's now changed minds since February?
Well, I have to be very cautious now what I'm going to say. You're trying to get me in trouble here. I actually worked for NATO for a couple of years, so I think it's fair to say I'm a fundamental believer in NATO. I think it has played an incredibly important role in the last many decades, now more than ever before, perhaps. But it's also fair to say that NATO is a conservative organization where it takes a little bit of time for it to sort of adopt to a new reality. So I, in fact, don't think that what we experienced was unexpected or problematic. What I'm just saying is that there is a new reality. Countries, as you mentioned before, are now beginning to send envoys to the technology industry. And I think whether you look at the European Union, whether you look at NATO, even the United Nations, are also beginning to look into a new geopolitical reality where technology is going to be such an important part of it. Look at the cybersecurity aspect of the war in Ukraine. I think it's sort of a no-brainer to all of us today why it is that we need to adapt to a much more different threat scenario. And I think NATO is looking at that direction, and I think that's a really important step.
We've heard a lot about the cyber record of the war and why did Russia not do as much as was perhaps anticipated. I know the strategic concept that everyone's waiting to find out today what's in it. We got a preview from NATO's own Assistant Secretary General, who's on the panel in Madrid. Once we get that, I might be getting a note about it. I'm not checking my Twitter, I promise. I'm actually getting notes from the producers on my phone.
It's because you're deeply concerned whether we will actually make the connection, is that right?
Exactly.
Okay.
I mean, I'm good with Twitter. I'm not that good. But part of what's expected in the strategic concept is that 10 years later since the last one, is we're going to get something that widens out beyond tanks and aircraft and traditional kinetic military power as defensive needs for the alliance, to cyber, supply chains, cloud, all these new areas that individual countries, especially back in Washington, are already pretty far into, as more than a large alliance can be. So, coming from Microsoft, what are you hoping to see in that concept, and what does that mean for the kind of products, networks, solutions you're going to have to create or hope to create for the member states of the alliance?
Yeah, I mean, let's see what comes out, and I haven't seen a version of it, but I think it's fair to say that we should sort of expect that what began at the London summit, the discussions around emerging and disruptive technologies, the consequences for NATO, I think that discussion in many ways will be culminating in Madrid later today or tomorrow in a new strategic concept that is going to acknowledge both a number of thematic areas. I mean, we've been speaking a bit about cybersecurity, I think artificial intelligence, cloud computing, quantum computing. I think those are areas that will not only be important if you want to create economic growth in Europe or in North America, they are in fact also becoming technologies that are going to have an impact on threat scenarios or the geopolitical situation around the world. So I think those are going to be important parts of it. And then, I have to say this, and it'll come as a shocking surprise to you. I think for us in the private sector, having wording both in the communiqué and in the strategic concept about the necessity of creating an interface between NATO and the private sector to discuss some of these issues, I hope to see that, and I think it would be, as I mentioned before, an important step for NATO, but frankly speaking also an important step for the private sector to increasingly acknowledge that we have a responsibility, whether we like it or not, to actually help ensure that NATO remains sort of the place to go in terms of technology, in terms of superiority in defending our societies, our values, and our approach.
In fact, that's one of the more recent ideas section commentaries on Defense One is calling for that exact thing, that NATO needs to codify or put into language more cooperation between industry and the states in developing everything that It's expected to be needed. I'm told that they're still working on their mics and miking up in Madrid because, Spain, what are you going to do? But here, but it's a nice climate, it's warm. So we're going to take some audience questions if you like. So I can let's see, hands up. We have this one in the back here. Maybe someone has a microphone to come around. Maybe not. Yes, coming. One moment, coming up behind you. Here you are.
Thank you. It's better than Madrid. I'm going to ask a hard question here. I know that your ambassador title comes from your previous work with Denmark, not Netherlands.
Thanks.
However, it seems to me that one company cannot be at the table. If you're at the table with NATO, you are no longer private, you are public. And so we're now talking about public infrastructure. So I would like to talk about the transformation for companies that have become essential infrastructure like Microsoft, like Google, like Amazon, into something that can really be a part of the public sphere. We need a new theory and a new model for this kind of dependency, in my opinion.
Listen, I think it's a fair point to make, and needless to say, we're not arguing that we need a place at the at the NAC or at the UN Security Council if you make the UN comparison. I think what we're saying is that the private sector, especially those that are involved in critical infrastructure, as we've seen with Ukraine, and whether we like it or not, it's on our software systems, it's on our cloud systems that we see some of the more vicious attacks against the Ukrainian society. And I think that makes it impossible for us to say we can be completely neutral here. And I'm not trying to sugarcoat or overdo what a company like Microsoft is doing in this area, but I think it is about leaning in and acknowledging that we don't have the answers. We're not the ones that need to define the governance structures of tomorrow, but we do have a responsibility for being a societally responsible player, including discussing what we see in terms of threats arising, for example, around cybersecurity. And I think that's the conversation we've been taking forward, and where, as I told Kevin before we went in here, and he promised me not to say it in here, but he did nonetheless, that there was a little bit of a distance before Ukraine talking to NATO. That distance is smaller today, but I think we need a number of different actors to be involved in those discussions.
Thank you. So, as you can see, we are connected to Madrid. We'll go live to them and listen in.
In the new strategic concept, and one which was being discussed at great length, at least prior to the 24th of February, which slightly interfered with many of our pre-existing plans, as you all know. And we have a wonderful panel, which is going to be moderated by Natalia Drozdiak, and she works at Bloomberg, where she currently covers NATO and EU foreign policy, but prior to that, she specialized in technological issues for some 6 years, and so I hope that she doesn't mind us dragging back into her former field of expertise. Natalia, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I have the pleasure to introduce a wonderful panel. We have David Van Wiel. He's the Assistant Secretary General for Emerging Security Challenges at NATO. Down the line from Brussels, we have Caspar Klinge. He's the Vice President for European Government Affairs for Microsoft. Back here in Madrid, Alejandro Romero. He's the Chief Operating Officer for Constella Intelligence and the board member of Telefonica Tech. We also have Francesca Bria, who's running a bit late. Her flight was delayed. She's the president of the Italian Innovation Fund, and she should be joining us any minute now. But we're going to get started right away, and I want to start with David. I want to take a bit of a step back and get your sense in terms of what we can expect and how tech will revolutionize the military going forward. I mean, can we expect like robots fighting robots? Paint us a picture.
Well, it's very difficult to look into the future, but if I look back into the past, which is easier to do, then innovation has always won wars. From the first man-made weapons to the invention of gunpowder, the use of horses, later the introduction of aircraft, innovation is critical when it comes down to maintaining the edge of your adversary in a conflict. And for years, we've been very well placed to have that technological edge, because a lot of the inventions, the great inventions that we all know from the 20th century, originated in the military domain. Think about the GPS, the global positioning system, the internet, or something simple like duct tape. They were all military inventions that later got a commercial civilian use. Now we have an issue at the moment as NATO and as militaries that a lot of the innovation nowadays comes out of the private sector. So it is being developed by startups, scale-ups, larger tech companies, academia, and it is predominantly designed for commercial use. And that's great. I mean, if you look at the innovation potential that we have in the Alliance, it's huge. We have 9 out of the 10 best universities in the world on our territories. We have 80% of all living Nobel laureates living in allied countries. 65% of all the venture capital going around in the world is being invested in allied countries. So we have a great basis, but we have an issue with translating that into the defense sector. And there's a number of reasons for that. And I'll start with one of the obvious ones that I think our colleagues from the private sector will recognize. We're difficult to deal with. We have long procurement processes. We have very strict requirements to what we think we need. So we leave little room for the creative minds, the innovators, to actually give us new technology. There's also a lot of unknowns, both sides. So a lot of the military operators don't know what's out there in the field of technology, and a lot of the technology developers don't know what the military would actually need in times of warfare. So we need to connect those two worlds. And I think that's what we're trying to do at NATO now, is to transform ourselves into an organization that is more connected to the innovation ecosystem, the private sector, academia, and the small startups and innovators that are making a difference in the world of tomorrow. So to finish off this first intervention, the 2 initiatives that the leaders are endorsing these 2 days in Madrid are the Defense Innovation Accelerator for the North Atlantic, or DIANA in short. I still think it's one of the best acronyms in NATO because it actually sticks to your mind. And the other one is the NATO Innovation Fund, which is a $1 billion venture capital investment fund that will invest in dual-use deep tech. So what DIANA does is reach out into those innovation ecosystems. Don't come to us, we'll come to you. It will be making use of accelerator sites that are existing in all the other countries, reaching out to the innovation community with military problems. For example, how can I communicate underwater over a distance of 100 kilometers? And then let's see what comes out of that first contest that we do. And if we get great ideas out of that, then we will actually sponsor startups. We will give them grants and we'll coach them, we'll mentor them, we'll expose them to end users in order to mature their product. And if they make the second cut, we'll give them even more money to mature their product, and then we'll make sure that we advertise that to all the allies and the industry. And the NATO Innovation Fund is a venture capital fund which can then at that stage come in and provide pre-seed and Series A financing for these startups, which is very difficult if you're working in the dual-use defense market because private capital is very hesitant to step in. So I'm not saying that we're going to change the world with these 2 initiatives. I would love to say that, but it is only a small first step in order to regain our contact with the deep innovation that we've lost over the years.
So Alex, I mean, from the private sector, what are your thoughts on NATO's new initiative here? Is this, what type of impact could this have? And I mean, just generally speaking, what gaps do NATO allies have when it comes to tech and securing that competitive advantage?
Okay, thank you for inviting me to this panel. And I want to build up on what David just said. I think that the initiatives that the NATO is taking along the lines of the DIANA initiative and the NATO Innovation Funds are, really relevant, and I believe from a private sector in the right direction. I encourage NATO to be more aggressive. If I take the example of the NATO fund, it's around $1 billion to be spent over 15 years. And if I take only one industry, cybersecurity, and only one country, Israel, and if I add the aggregate of all the funding rounds of the last year, is $8.8 billion. So this gives an idea of the order of magnitudes that we need to attract in this space and in a critical area like cybersecurity. And then in terms of further collaboration, I think that there are multiple areas in which collaboration with the private sector can be improved. You mentioned a very important one, which is procurement. But I believe that in the private sector and also in the defense sector, we are facing talent shortage, lack of talent. So, for example, in cybersecurity, there are as many people working as open positions in the industry. So being able to access talent at a scale is something that is also an area of concern for us, and where we could be collaborating with NATO. I think also cooperation on threat analysis. If we look at, for example, critical infrastructure, a significant amount of the critical infrastructure is owned by private companies. A collaboration or a close collaboration between private companies and allies and NATO could be also relevant. And then finally, I would like to bring the attention on public awareness. I believe that especially in the younger generations, raising awareness about the relevance of defense, raising awareness about the potential dual use of technology is very relevant in order to understand the role of NATO and how critical this is for the defense of the allied countries.
So I'm going to see if we can check in with Kevin in Brussels down the line. Kevin, can you hear me?
Can you hear us?
Can you? Yes, we can.
Excellent. Well, thank you.
So tell us.
Yeah, I'm here with Casper Kling, the Vice President from Microsoft. So we just heard a lot about NATO's efforts for innovation, which are often focused on startups. And it's assumed that's where the creativity is coming from. But you're here from Microsoft. That's not a startup. That's one of the largest firms in the world. So how does that music play in your ear? Is that and how does Microsoft respond or fit into a future that's focused on innovation and startup land when you're coming from something a little different?
Yeah, no, thanks a lot, Kevin, and good to see everybody on the Madrid end. And I'm going to disappoint you because it's going to be very difficult for me to disagree with what David said. And I know I've been enormously annoying towards David in the last 2 years because I've been knocking on his door to try and sort of get a conversation going. Because I think one of the aspects that David laid out so well was, of course, that in today's world, civilian companies, including a company like Microsoft, the technology that we develop and deploy, again, whether we like it or not, is used also in the military domain or in the military space. And if we just use a couple of minutes to talk about what we've seen in Ukraine with the Russian invasion, I think the interesting aspect is that even before the first missile or the first shot was fired, the war had already begun through severe and significant cyber attacks that only increased in the months and in the days before the 24th of February. So I think it also shows that in today's world, it is not only about territorial sovereignty in the traditional sense, about having soldiers on the ground. If we want to protect our societies, our institutions, our democratic values, we actually also need to make sure that we have a virtual defense up and running, and this is where the private sector comes in. And I think people around the room or in Madrid will probably know that we've been incredibly engaged in also trying to support the Ukrainian authorities with state-of-the-art technology to try and defend them against cyber attacks. And I think, again, if we talk about artificial intelligence, quantum computing, cloud computing, many of these issues will have an impact on NATO, which is why I think what we will see come out of Madrid today and tomorrow is going to be, quite a dramatic and quite an important step forward in bringing NATO from the London summit, focusing on emerging and disruptive technologies, to actually creating a framework where NATO will align more with the new digital reality, but will also enable NATO to work closer together with the private sector, even big startups like Microsoft.
Yeah, and even if I get a quick follow-up before I throw it back to Madrid, even if the new strategic concept says, okay, we also believe that cybersecurity, supply chains, AI, those are all important tools, weapons, whatever you want to call them. What does that mean? How does that help foster new technologies, get the solutions faster to the tip of the spear, to the war fighters and the commanders who need them immediately.
But I think, as David mentioned, there are some specific steps being taken. I think Diana is an important step in actually creating a completely different approach to procurement. Instead of saying, here's a problem and these are the specifications for the solutions to that problem. I mean, NATO is, in my view, or as far as I understand, going to say, here's a problem, come with a proposal how to fix that. And I think that brings back the innovation to sort of the collaborative efforts around NATO, but I think it also brings more awareness, not only to a big company like Microsoft or some of the other big players, but also to startups or small and medium-sized enterprises, that there is an opportunity to work and fundamentally support NATO with technology that is going to be absolutely decisive, not only in terms of building the jobs of tomorrow or creating economic growth, but actually also in making sure that NATO will defend the societies that we live in.
That's good. Diana is a better acronym than Wonder Woman, I think. but good for the memory, as I said. So Madrid, back to you.
Take it back now. And I'd like to introduce Francesca. She managed to join us, and I want to get your thoughts. NATO's has this innovation fund, 1 billion euros, but the EU is also making some efforts in this area. Why is there such a focus on deep tech in particular? And also, Alex mentioned dual use. Can you tell us a bit more about that? Is that a better investment case from your perspective? Thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you. I think I will continue to emphasize what was already said in terms of the need of innovation in dual-use technologies, because there is a huge opportunity for these disruptive and emerging technologies to emphasize not only the ability in order to tackle our national security objectives, but also our broader objectives as society. So the UN development goals and the kind of human rights agenda. And I think broadly, really, the defense of our citizens' ability to be safe, secure, and have their rights protected as a democracy. And I think there is a need not only to have those kind of standards and requirements and security, let's say, by design. So security-centered world. Imagine when we are talking about quantum cryptography or smart cities or even digitization of energy infrastructures, these kind of IoT scenarios where it touches everyone's life. So there, the alliance, this kind of public-private partnerships, the kind of triple helix alliance between the private, the public, and academia, society at large is very important. When it comes to financing innovation, I think if we do not see the need for patient long-term capital in funding deep tech, which is the disruptive emerging technologies that will lead us to reshape the future, I mean, of course, it's capital intensive. It needs exactly patience, and we need to bet on the actual talent that can scale. So there we need to pull in large-scale public investments that can be like mixed funding. It can be a mix of grants, a mix of equity, or even venture capital funds. So when it comes to the EC, the European Union is becoming very, I think, ambitious now, because it's always being seen as a kind of regulatory power for the digital age. So betting on the ability to regulate and to put democracy at the center of the future vision of technology. But now, obviously, we understand we also have to compete on technology and innovation capabilities, and that's why we created the European Innovation Council, which has a 3.5 billion venture capital fund. This is the first time that the Commission does something like this, and also 1.2 billion in mix of grant and equity funding for deep tech scale-ups. And another initiative that's very important to me and ambitious, which is the European Technology Champion Initiatives, which is a 10 billion multi-partners and multi-governments fund, which is managed by the European Innovation Funds with 16 governments that are already part of it. And the ambition is to create the next 100 VC funds in Europe to grow deep tech champions. And I think this is a great opportunity because we can then create this pan-alliance innovation ecosystem where we bring together, of course, the defense capabilities, because it has to be built with security, ethics, and the capacity to protect our citizens in mind with standards that we need from the security community, and then public investment that can leverage 3 or 4 times private investment. And that's, I think, where we're going to have a real capacity to protect our industrial capacity, our industrial base.
So we've been talking a bit about the gaps that NATO as an alliance has in terms of tech, but from the EU and from the US in the fight against in the war in Ukraine, we have seen some sanctions against Russia on the technology front. And I was curious to get your thoughts, David. You know, what are we seeing in terms of impact already on the ground in the war there?
Well, we're either already seeing the impact or we will be seeing the impact very soon, because especially the ban on sophisticated semiconductors is going to have a huge impact on the production processes, the production lines of military equipment in Russia. So with sanctions, you always hope to expect that within 24 hours they will kick in. They don't. It takes time. But in time, they will hurt. And in specific technologies, it will be very hard for Russia to build up that capacity on their own. Of course, apart from the West, there are other producers, and of course, China is a big upcoming player in this field. But it takes time to change your production processes. So I think we will see difficulties on the Russian side as a result of these sanctions. At the same time, it is heartening to see that innovation on the Ukrainian side has taken a huge flight. Kasper already mentioned the cyber attacks, and Microsoft has done some great work in mitigating the attacks and moving Ukraine to the cloud. So just as an example of the role that the private sector nowadays plays in these kind of conflicts. But we can all now sing along the Bayraktar drone song as an example of new technologies, rather cheap technologies if you compare it to a fighter jet, that are having a huge impact on the ground in Ukraine. Or the use of artificial intelligence language processing to translate all the intercepted Russian communications and then search for different worlds. The use of facial recognition to identify the human rights violators in Bucha. It is a great example of a whole of society effort that is now going into keeping Ukraine safe and upgrading and innovating their military as they fight. Now, I'd rather have we don't wait for a conflict like that, but learn from what we see and make sure that we institutionalize that cooperation between the private sector, academia, and the government in order to provide safe technology, rightly said by Francesca, based on our values, because that is what distinguishes us from our adversaries, is that we are democratic nations, we have values and principles, and these need to be translated into our new technologies as well.
Should we check in with Kasper to get his thoughts on the war in Ukraine, especially on the cyber front, and also just more broadly, you know, where can NATO as an alliance improve on the cyber front? Microsoft had a report recently about Russian cyber espionage. I'd be curious to get your thoughts, Kasper.
Yeah, no, thanks very much. But I think again, we have a situation where there has been sort of a pre-Ukraine and a post-Ukraine approach to how we look at cybersecurity. And there's nothing new about cybersecurity. I think most of us have been arguing for many, many years that this is a threat that we have to protect ourselves against. I think what we've seen now is the coming together of cybersecurity attacks together with kinetic activities on the ground at a scale that we perhaps haven't seen before. And I think the sort of foundational conclusion in this is that we have a hybrid warfare in Ukraine, perhaps at a level we haven't seen before, and the response to that has to be a hybrid response as well that involves also the private sector. And you mentioned before some of the work that we've been doing. I think it's fair to say it hasn't been particularly easy. One of the reasons it hasn't been easy is because many of the Ukrainian authorities were actually hosting their data sets or their infrastructure on-premise, in other words, having servers in the basement that were easier targets also for Russia and trying to knock out the sort of critical infrastructure in Ukraine. So one of the areas we've been investing a lot in is to try and migrate, in fact, 16 out of 17 Ukrainian ministries to the cloud in order to try and defend their ability to have functioning institutions and services up and running despite the war on the ground. But you point to a number of other areas that are increasingly important as well, which is, traditional espionage. We've seen a rise in attacks against, in fact, 42 countries outside Ukraine conducted from Russia, which has been sort of more traditional espionage, but I think also basically disruptive in its nature. And we've also seen an increase, a quite dramatic increase in what you could call sort of cyber influencing campaigns that I think we don't need to talk too much about what kind of impact it has on our societies. And I think when you put all of that into the same basket, what do we need to do more of? And this is one of the discussions we've had with David and his team for many months and years, is that, if we look at cybersecurity, a company like Microsoft, like many other companies, we have access to real-time threat intelligence, and making that available to NATO through some sort of interface mechanism, I think is one of the areas that we need to look into. I think we have an obligation as a company, similarly to what other speakers said before, about fundamentally helping to protect democratic institutions and the values of the societies that we live in. And by the way, the values that is also the place where Microsoft originates from. And that's what we're trying to do by leaning into the situation right now.
Kevin, just checking if there's anything you wanted to add, or if you wanted to jump in. Otherwise, I'll turn to Alex.
The strategic concept that we're all anticipating today is supposed to reflect a lesson learned and change how NATO thinks. And physically, what do you think of traditional military hardware? The idea is that NATO shouldn't have just enough on the eastern border to absorb a Russian attack that might literally take over and invade the eastern countries, and then NATO can then figure out a solution to push back and respond. The new thinking is there will be enough firepower deployed to deter that attack to begin with. What's the cyber version of that? What's the technology version of that you think is the future ahead, where it's not enough to just wait for those attacks and play defense as a defensive alliance, rather something new, and the new strategic concept has to be put forth?
So I think the lesson learned from Ukraine, but of course also from some of the previous major cybersecurity attacks that we've seen in the last couple of years, is of course that no industry, no government is going to be left untouched by that. And I think building up appropriate resilience is going to be critically important. I mean, in my past life, when I was still working for government, I was stationed in Southeast Asia when NotPetya happened back in 2017. Almost exactly on the day we're sitting here. And I remember quite clearly how that crippled a number of very big international corporations in a way that they were unable to conduct business. And I think that was a wake-up call for some industries and some sectors. We can say very little good is coming out of the atrocities on the ground in Ukraine right now, but perhaps one of the things that we can use Ukraine to do is to build up more awareness of the need to do more. You need to protect yourself. We need to protect ourselves as a company, but we also need governments, academia, institutions to do more to protect themselves. And I think there is a technology solution to that, and of course, like many other companies, we're heavily involved in that part of it. But there is also a regulatory aspect of that, where we're seeing the European Union, not least in these months, actually providing, I would say, sort of a wave of different regulations that are going to increase obligations for all of us in having state-of-the-art technology to protect ourselves against cybersecurity attacks. There might be another aspect to this, which I think is interesting when we look at NATO and the discussions that are ongoing, which is sort of the more normative dimension of emerging and disruptive technologies. I mean, can NATO, similarly to the European Union, create a Brussels effect where you actually help set the standards around the application of new technologies in the battle space, in the military domain? And I think that's a really interesting way forward. I don't know whether that will be in the communiqué or in the strategic concept, but it might be an area where NATO could look into in the coming years.
Well, we can send it back to Madrid, and maybe David can tell us. He's from NATO. He knows what's in the strategic concept, right?
Yeah, but I can't tell you yet because then I'll be spoiling the news coming out today. But I can promise you that all that's been discussed here is featuring very prominently in the new strategic concept. We realize that this is a critical part of the future of warfare and defense and deterrence. And to make it concrete on the normative front, we're already starting to do that because we realize that these technologies need to go regulated, especially if we use them in the field of defense and security. So last October, for example, we published our AI strategy. So that's an AI strategy, but only focused on the use for defense and security. And a large part of that consists of principles of responsible use. And for those who work with AI, they're not mind-boggling or groundbreaking. They're about fighting bias, they're about meaningful human-machine interaction, they're about lawfulness. But these principles are key to our innovators that are working for defense and security because they want to design technology that is actually aligned with our values and not being misused. It's key for the end users because military end users working with AI want to have a level of trust in what the technology that they're operating will actually do. And thirdly, and that's what Casper said, the Brussels effect, it also sends a signal to all the Western companies and hopefully beyond that these are the standards for new technology that we expect all to adhere to. So that was only AI. The strategic concept will mention that in more broader terms as one of the roles that NATO can play. We don't do hard law like the EU, but we can set standards and norms and make sure that if we at 30 or since yesterday at 32 soon agree on what we find the acceptable standards, then hopefully that will have an effect far beyond the NATO territory and make the world a safer place.
Alex, I'm curious to get your thoughts. I mean, from your point of view, where do you think NATO can improve on the cyber front? And just secondly, I mean, since we're talking about the strategic concept, we know that China will be mentioned, and we expect that NATO may call out their control of critical infrastructure. And I'm curious to get your thoughts. I mean, given that telecom is such an important aspect of that, you know, is this threat exaggerated? And I mean, if it isn't, what can NATO do to reduce that reliance? Thanks.
Okay, I would like to build up on what has been said by Casper and by David and add 3 key learnings we are having at the cybersecurity space based on the war at Ukraine. The first one is, I believe that NATO and the allies should be doing much more in terms of awareness on civil society, on the threat in the cyberspace. Different research shows how the perceived threat of civilians changes significantly based on the distance to the border with Russia. But in the internet, we are all neighbors. So we are all neighbors of Russia or of China, of Iran. And you know, cybersecurity on the digital space, it's certainly a threat that should be perceived by civil society regardless of where you are geographically located. The second key learning, and building up on what Casper said, the move of a lot of the infrastructure that was on premises to the cloud has really made it life more difficult for the bad actors. So what we are observing in the cybersecurity space is that bad actors are going to areas or towards areas of less friction. And the areas of less friction are humans. So basically trying to replace the digital identity of politicians or executives is one of the key vectors attacks that we are observing both in APTs, in advanced persistent threat actors, and also cyber criminals. I'll give you one example. We released recently an analysis on critical infrastructure, on energy, and we discovered that 45% of the top executives of the largest 20 companies, energy companies in the world had credentials exposed in deep and dark web. And more we see how this can be weaponized and can be used to first penetrate an organization and then move laterally in order to attack these organizations. We have also some interesting examples, but actors like Lapsus are poaching employees of critical infrastructure companies, offering them 20, 30K a week just to provide credentials to access critical infrastructure. So I think identity is going to be definitely, as the security in the cloud increases, an area of interest. And then finally, I want to raise awareness on a third element, and Casper was talking about the coordination of kinetic action and cybersecurity and cyber action, wiper attacks and destructive attacks. We see a third element that we believe is very, very important, which is disinformation and malign campaigns. More and more, we are talking about APTs, advanced persistent threat actors in the cybersecurity space, but we are also coining a term of APM, advanced persistent manipulators. In the Ukrainian war, we have seen how Russia has been very effective crafting very divisive narratives against the allies and NATO outside the Western world, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, in Asia, and in Latin America. And that represents an important threat that also needs to be taken into account.
And on the telecom front, with the China threat, can you tell us what your thoughts are there?
Well, I think in general, and I wouldn't limit this to infrastructure, but obviously supply chain is going to be a critical element, because supply chain can be significantly weaponized. And we have recent examples. The SolarWing attacks are a very, very good example on the impact that the supply chain can have across a country, a region, or the world. And definitely, as we jump into 5G, and we are already talking about 6G, as IoT is becoming a critical foundation of our industries and our lives, supply chain, and that includes obviously telecom infrastructure, are going to be very, very relevant, and definitely needs to be an area of very deep focus from a regulatory perspective, but also from a defense perspective.
On the capability side, I just want to check in with Francesca, and then we'll go to questions in the room here and in Brussels. So why don't you can start thinking about them while I ask Francesca. On the capabilities side, China and Russia, I mean, how far behind is the EU and the US in certain areas? And what is your main concern?
I think what was said for me in the panel is very important. That is to push the higher level ethical direction, and then get the democracies through also international regulation and agreements to set the principles and standards, also via experimentation, testing, standard settings, and then get the investment behind. Because I think this is our strength. Our strength is that we recognize how those disruptive and emerging technologies can bring lots of benefits. I mean, not only for the defense industry and in kind of war scenarios, but also broadly. But if they are misused, they can be detrimental to our democracy and our fundamental values. And what was mentioned, for example, threats around disinformation and around kind of pervasive manipulation of data and technologies, I think this will become also a key issue. It has been mentioned, the cybersecurity regulation, the information security regulation, the AI Act, and also what NATO is doing in that front, but also the Data Governance Act. When it comes to people will need to have trust. They will need to feel that they can own their digital assets. They can own, their data and their identity. We also have to understand, and this is linked to kind of massive digitization of people identities, payment systems, cryptocurrencies. All kinds of new services are being introduced in society. So this goes beyond, only the scenarios that we are talking about. And I think for me, this kind of vision that we may have as allied, as democracies, to make it happen with those very strong ethical direction is what I think we should use as our competitive advantage. So I don't think that, because usually we say regulation makes it slow and we need to agree all together in a democracies, and we're going to be beaten because China, it's going to be faster and they're going to outperform us. But those technologies are being going to be pervasive throughout society. They have to integrate to the institutions of society we have today. So if we do it right, and if we are convincing people that we may keep the open and safe society, yes, with our technological improvements, then I think we will have an edge. We will have this edge that is not only technological, because digital sovereignty is also economic, political sovereignty, and of course, the military sovereignty.
I think that's a very optimistic note to wrap up on.
We have to, because otherwise, we know, I mean, all the rest, it was said, you know, material scarcity, food crisis, supply chain disaster, supply shock, I may say, but also, again, the data is going to be a big fight because there is a lot of power asymmetries, and we have the fight for talent also, because we need these STEM capabilities to be here. So we need to attract the more talented people. We need to be a better university, better education, better public sector in order to leverage the capacity throughout society. So the challenges are many. I think we need to be optimistic that as democracies, we can have an edge. We can have a competitive capacity here.
So let's check in with Brussels. Kevin, is there anyone in the crowd there that wants to ask a question?
We have a question set up for you right here.
Hi, my name is Owen Daniels. I work at Georgetown University's Center for Security and Emerging Technology. Technology literacy is a key challenge in both the civilian and defense sectors, particularly so policymakers can know the levers that they have available to them when it comes to emerging tech. I was wondering what the panelists think about how NATO can or should promote tech literacy both within the alliance and then also among member states. Thank you.
What do you think of that right here in the room?
I think the first thing is to say I think it's a really great question, because I think you're pointing to one of the areas that I know, David, the rest of the NATO organization is focusing on, and increasingly also we're focusing on the private sector, which is to make sure that the gap between where policymakers are and where the technology is, that gap is being reduced as we go along. So actually, I think one of the interesting aspects of your question is, why do we want an interface between the private sector and NATO? What's the interest for Microsoft in this area? Well, I think we have a couple of different interests. One is to make sure we help educate, a very important defense organization about where technology is today. And I'm a simple political scientist. I'm not an engineer. So it's been a steep learning curve for me to come into Microsoft and sit in front of our engineers and understand how fast the deployment and development of AI is, or quantum computing. And don't ask me any follow-up questions, because I will fail completely on that one. But I think the interesting aspect is, even for those of us that are working in the private sector, we see in many ways an unprecedented pace in the development of new technologies that is going to have a profound impact on the world, on geopolitics, on the opportunities to create the jobs and the growth of tomorrow. And that requires us to work closer together. But I actually think I just wanted to come back to the point just made. One of the areas we're investing in Microsoft, but many other companies are doing the same, is in fact on skilling. And we do that for two reasons. One is a very selfish thing, which is we can't attract the number of cybersecurity experts that we need for our own business today. So to those that are a little bit younger than I am today, go into that area. There are huge opportunities in terms of employment. But the other reason is, of course, we live on the basis of trust. Now, if you don't have trust in our technology, you're not going to use our technology. And the problem with cybersecurity, and if you want me to be a little bit tedious, if you look around the room here today, because what we say is so incredibly boring, most of you are sitting with your device in front of you and probably reading emails or tweeting or doing something more interesting. And that, of course, also shows the vulnerability we have, because we are connected today, and cybersecurity is going to be one of those aspects. So in order to increase awareness, we also need to invest in skilling and developing more competences in those areas. And I know that our friends in NATO do not disagree on that one. And by the way, we're here to help together with many other companies, both on the other side of the Atlantic, but certainly also here in Europe.
Thank you. Madrid, back to you.
I think we'll have to leave it with Casper. And I just want to thank all the panelists, David, Alex, Francesca, and down the line, Kevin and Casper, for this wonderful panel. Just a note to the crowd here in Madrid, we'll take a short break now. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Good job.
It could have been a lot worse.
Very good. I think we have Ian here to send.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. Casper, thank you very much. Pleasure, thank you. So before we actually close out Brussels Forum, we thought it would be a wonderful idea to have, a great friend actually of Brussels Forum, but also a very keen observer of all the issues we've been talking about, come out and share with us some thoughts about, some reflections on what he heard, and maybe even a little bit about what we might discuss next year. And so in order to do that, we're really delighted to have with us Professor Timothy Garton-Ash from Oxford University. Timothy, please join us. So tell us a little bit. You've started out Brussels forums, you've listened to them. What did you hear a little bit, and what do you take away?
So I have 2 or 3 benchmarks for you next year to see where we've got to. I was a terrific forum, congratulations, some fascinating sessions, and very good news from Madrid on Finland and Sweden. The first one is, have we stayed the course for Ukraine?